You planned a full effort push. But you didn't start. You adjusted, reduced, delayed. And now the pattern is repeating without resistance. This is where discipline stops being a question and becomes a fixed response. The failure isn't in intensity. It's in the gap before movement. Your body leans back slightly. Hands stay still longer than needed. There is a small pause, almost invisible, where the decision stretches. That stretch is where everything breaks. You tell yourself the effort has to be worth it. That if it's not big, it doesn't count. So you wait. You wait for the right condition, the right energy, the right version of yourself. But nothing begins. The chain isn't broken by weakness. It's broken by hesitation dressed as precision. And each time you choose not to act because it feels too small, you reinforce the delay that will stop you again. The pause feels small, so you ignore it. Your fingers rest on the edge of the table, not moving. Your shoulders stay slightly lowered, as if waiting for a signal that never comes. The task is already clear. Nothing is missing. Still, you don't begin. The mind steps in with quiet adjustments. It suggests a better moment. A cleaner start. A version where the effort matches some internal standard. Not extreme, just slightly more aligned. Slightly more complete. You accept this without noticing. So nothing happens. The delay doesn't feel like failure. It feels controlled. It feels intentional. That's what makes it dangerous. You're not collapsing. You're holding back. And that distinction lets the pattern survive. Your body learns it. The next time, the hesitation arrives earlier. Faster. More natural. Your hand hovers before movement. Your breath slows just enough to stall. You don't see it as resistance anymore. It feels like part of the process. But it's not part of the process. It's the break inside it. You believe effort defines discipline. Big sessions. Full intensity. Visible strain. But those only appear after something has already started. And for you, that start point is unstable. You wait for effort before action. That reverses everything. Action is supposed to come before effort. Movement before intensity. The system doesn't require readiness. It requires initiation. But your pattern demands the opposite. It demands proof before beginning. So you never build continuity. Your body stays in neutral longer than it should. There's always a slight delay before standing, before reaching, before executing the first motion. That delay compounds. It stretches across the day, attaching itself to every task. And because it's small, you don't confront it. You think the real problem is inconsistency at a larger scale. Missed days. Dropped routines. But those are outcomes. The source is always this moment. This fraction of time where nothing happens. That's where the chain breaks. Even when you manage to act, it feels heavier than it should. Because you're not just doing the task. You're overcoming the delay that came before it. That extra weight builds resistance for the next time. So the system weakens. Your mind keeps trying to correct it with bigger effort. You plan harder sessions. Longer durations. More demanding standards. But those only increase the pressure before starting. And pressure feeds hesitation. You tighten the requirement. The body responds by slowing down more. Now the smallest action feels like it needs to justify itself. A short session doesn't seem enough. A partial effort feels incomplete. So you skip it. Or delay it. Or wait until you can do it properly. But properly never arrives on time. So the gap remains. And inside that gap, the pattern becomes stable. It doesn't need intensity to survive. It only needs that moment of hesitation to stay unchallenged. Once that moment is allowed, everything after it becomes negotiable. You don't lose discipline in big failures. You lose it in these small pauses that go unchecked. The system doesn't collapse loudly. It erodes quietly, one delayed movement at a time. And as long as you treat small actions as insignificant, you will continue reinforcing the exact behavior that prevents any larger effort from ever becoming consistent. You let it happen again, and this time it feels even more normal. The task is smaller than before. It should be easier to start. Your body knows exactly what to do. Still, there is that same quiet hold. Your hand pauses just above the first movement. Your back leans slightly into the chair instead of forward. The action waits. And the mind fills that space. Not with loud excuses. Just small adjustments. Do it properly. Give it a full effort. Make it count. Each one sounds reasonable. Each one delays the start by a few more seconds. You don't resist them. You follow them. So the action stays untouched. This is where the pattern reveals itself. It's not that you refuse to act. It's that you've trained yourself to only respect action when it looks significant. Anything smaller feels like it doesn't register. So your body holds back, waiting for a version of effort that meets that standard. But that standard is unstable. Your fingers tighten slightly, then release. Your breath shifts, shallow for a moment, then steadies again. The body is ready. The delay is not physical. It's conditioned. You've linked starting with proving. Every time you think a small action isn't enough, you reinforce the delay before it. You turn simple movement into a decision. And decisions invite negotiation. So the loop continues. You notice it more now. The hesitation isn't random. It shows up in the same way. Same posture. Same stillness. Same slight resistance before the first step. It doesn't matter if the task is large or small. The pattern applies equally. That's the problem. Because the system doesn't distinguish between them. A delayed small action weakens the same chain as a missed large one. The body doesn't measure importance. It records behavior. And your behavior says, wait until it matters. So it always waits. You try to correct it by raising the stakes. You tell yourself to commit harder. To push more. To remove distraction. But those responses operate after the start point. They don't touch the hesitation itself. So nothing changes. The delay becomes faster. More efficient. It doesn't need long reasoning anymore. A single thought is enough to pause the movement. Sometimes not even a thought. Just a feeling that it's not the right moment yet. And you obey it. That obedience is the reinforcement. The body begins to expect permission before acting. It looks for alignment, for readiness, for confirmation that the effort will be worth it. When that confirmation doesn't appear, it stays still. This is how small actions lose their place. Not because they lack value, but because you've removed their authority. You've decided they don't count unless they lead somewhere visible. So they get ignored. And without them, nothing larger can stabilize. Because large effort depends on small consistency. But your pattern is reversed. You chase intensity, then lose it. You wait for momentum, then never build it. You expect continuity to appear without the repetitions that create it. So the cycle resets. You sit in front of the same task again. The same environment. The same body position. And once again, the movement doesn't begin when it should. It waits. Just slightly. Just enough. And that just enough is what keeps everything from locking into place. Until that moment changes, nothing else will. The delay is no longer something you question. It fits into your movements now. Your body settles into it without resistance. You sit down, the task in front of you, and there's that same slight hold. Your hands don't move immediately. Your posture stays loose, uncommitted. Nothing forces the first action. And because nothing forces it, it doesn't happen. You've trained yourself to wait for a signal that never arrives. Not a loud one. Just a subtle confirmation that this moment is worth acting on. When that confirmation is missing, you stay still. The action gets pushed a few seconds forward, then a few more. Those seconds accumulate. Your breath stays steady, but shallow. Your fingers press lightly against the surface, then lift, then return again. The motion almost begins, but never completes. It looks like preparation. It feels like readiness. But it isn't movement. And without movement, nothing builds. You still believe that when it matters, you'll act. That when the pressure is high enough, the delay will disappear. But that belief is built on the same pattern that's holding you in place. Because the system doesn't activate under pressure if it isn't already active without it. It just repeats what it knows. And what it knows is hesitation. Small actions are the only place where that pattern can be broken. Not because they are easier, but because they are immediate. They don't require justification. They don't need the right conditions. They only need one thing: initiation. But your pattern rejects that. It keeps asking for more. More certainty. More alignment. More reason to begin. So the smallest actions get filtered out. Ignored. Delayed. And with them, the entire chain collapses again. You don't notice the cost right away. The day still moves. Other things fill the space. But the absence builds. Not as a single failure, but as a series of missed starts. Each one small enough to dismiss. Each one reinforcing the same behavior. Until it becomes default. Now your body expects delay before every action. It doesn't prepare to move. It prepares to wait. And that expectation shapes everything that follows. Tasks feel heavier. Starts feel harder. Not because they are, but because the system in place makes them that way. So you try to compensate. You push for larger effort again. You set higher standards. You look for moments where you can prove that you're capable. And sometimes you are. You act with intensity. You complete something demanding. But it doesn't last. Because the foundation underneath it is unstable. The small actions that should carry everything forward are still missing. And without them, the system resets every time. Back to hesitation. Back to delay. Back to waiting for the moment to feel right. The pattern doesn't break with effort. It breaks with repetition at the smallest level. But as long as those small movements are treated as optional, they will never become consistent. And without consistency, nothing else holds. The delay remains. And everything continues to start too late. You reach the point where even the delay feels built in. It's no longer something you notice as a disruption. It blends into the movement itself. You sit, you look, you wait. The gap appears automatically. Your shoulders don't tighten into action. They settle. Your body has learned that nothing needs to begin immediately. So it doesn't. This is where the break becomes permanent if nothing changes. Not because of lack of effort, but because the starting point has been removed from urgency. Action has become conditional. It waits for approval that never comes. And the longer that pattern runs, the harder it is to see. Your hand moves slightly, then stops. The motion isn't blocked. It's interrupted from within. A small internal check happens before execution. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just enough to pause the action. You don't question it anymore. You accept it as part of how things work. That acceptance is the reinforcement. Because once the delay is accepted, it no longer feels like resistance. It feels normal. And what feels normal doesn't get corrected. It gets repeated. So the system locks in place. You keep thinking the issue is scale. That you need to act bigger, commit harder, push further. But none of that reaches this moment. None of it touches the instant before movement. And that's the only place where control exists. Everything after is already decided. Small actions don't carry weight in your current pattern. They don't feel meaningful. They don't feel like progress. So they're ignored, passed over, delayed until they disappear. But those are the only actions that don't require negotiation. A small movement doesn't need energy. It doesn't need preparation. It doesn't need alignment. It only needs execution. Immediate, without evaluation. And because of that, it's the only place where the delay can be cut clean. Not reduced. Removed. The moment your body moves without waiting, the pattern breaks. Not gradually. Instantly. Because the loop depends entirely on that pause. Without it, there's nothing to sustain the delay. But you don't trust that. You still look for confirmation. You still check if the action is worth starting. And in doing so, you bring the delay back into place. You rebuild the same loop, even when you recognize it. So recognition alone changes nothing. Only repetition does. Not repetition of effort. Repetition of immediate movement. The smallest possible action, executed without pause. Again. And again. Until the body stops expecting permission. Until the hand moves before the thought forms. Until the start happens without resistance. That's where the shift begins. Not in intensity. Not in scale. But in removing the gap that has been controlling everything. And once that gap is gone, the rest follows without needing to be forced. The moment repeats, but something shifts in how it is handled. The task is still there. The same position, the same stillness in your hands, the same slight delay trying to form. Your fingers rest against the surface, ready to move, but this time, the pause doesn't extend. The hand moves anyway. Not fully committed. Not with intensity. Just enough to break the pattern. A small motion, almost insignificant. But it happens without waiting. And that changes the sequence immediately. Because the delay was the control point. Once the movement starts, the body follows. Your posture adjusts forward. Your shoulders tighten slightly into position. The breath stabilizes with the motion instead of before it. There's no build-up, no preparation phase stretching the moment. It begins. And because it begins, it continues. The action itself is still small. It doesn't match the standard you used to wait for. It doesn't feel complete. But it doesn't stop. That's the difference. The system isn't asking if it's enough. It's just executing what comes next. One movement leads to another. Your body no longer checks for permission between each step. The sequence connects. Not perfectly, but continuously. And that continuity removes the weight that used to build before starting. There's no resistance stacking up, because nothing is being held back. The delay has no space to return. You feel the absence of it more than anything else. That usual hesitation, the slight pull backward, is gone in this moment. Not because it disappeared permanently, but because it wasn't given time to form. That's how it weakens. Not by confronting it directly. Not by arguing against it. But by acting before it stabilizes. The pattern depends on time. A few seconds of stillness. A short internal check. Remove that, and the loop can't complete. So the action continues. It doesn't become intense. It doesn't suddenly turn into a full effort push. It stays small. Controlled. Repeated. But now it's anchored in movement instead of delay. And that makes it stable. You don't need to convince yourself to continue. The continuation is already happening. The next step doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like a continuation of what has already started. That's where consistency forms. Not from forcing larger effort, but from eliminating the interruption between actions. The smaller the gap, the stronger the chain. And here, there is no visible gap. Just movement. Your body starts to recognize this as the new default. Not because it feels better, but because it happens more quickly than the old pattern. There's no time for negotiation. No space for adjustment. The action arrives first. And once it arrives first, everything else follows behind it. This is where small actions take control. They don't rely on readiness. They don't wait for alignment. They don't require justification. They only require that the movement begins before the delay can take shape. And when that happens repeatedly, the system resets itself. The pause that used to dominate the start becomes harder to access. It doesn't disappear instantly, but it loses its position. It no longer sits at the front of every action. It gets pushed out by immediate movement. That's the shift. Not visible from the outside. Not dramatic. But stable. Because now, the start happens on contact. And once that becomes consistent, larger effort no longer needs to be forced. It builds on top of something that is already in motion. Now the pattern is exposed under pressure, not just at the start. The movement begins faster than before, but something tries to interrupt it mid-flow. Your hand is already working, your body slightly leaned forward, breath steady, but a thought slips in. Stop here. This is enough. The motion slows for a fraction. Not fully stopping. Just enough to test if the sequence will break again. This is where it used to collapse. Before, once the interruption appeared, you followed it. You stepped out of the action, even if it had already begun. The delay didn't only exist at the start. It could re-enter at any point, as long as there was space for it. But now, there is less space. Your body continues moving. Not faster. Not harder. Just without stopping. The hands keep working. The posture holds forward. The sequence doesn't reset. That small interruption doesn't gain control. Because the response is already decided. There is no evaluation of whether to continue. No internal check to confirm if the effort is still worth it. The action that started without hesitation continues the same way. Immediate. Unquestioned. And that removes the second layer of delay. Your fingers tighten slightly as they move, not from strain but from continuity. The movement carries its own momentum now. Each step leads into the next without pause. There's no gap wide enough for negotiation to expand. The interruption weakens. It still appears, but it doesn't land the same way. It doesn't stop the motion. It doesn't redirect the body. It stays at the edge, without influence. That's the difference. Before, the pattern had two control points, the start, and the continuation. Now both are closing. The start happens without delay, and the continuation holds without interruption. So the chain stays intact. You notice something shift in the body. The action doesn't feel heavy anymore. Not because it's easier, but because it's uninterrupted. There's no extra effort spent restarting. No repeated friction at every step. Just steady execution. And that steadiness removes the need for intensity. You don't have to push harder to maintain the action. You only have to avoid stopping. That becomes the rule. Simple. Non-negotiable. Continue. Even when the thought returns, this is enough. The body doesn't respond to it. It keeps moving. The sequence overrides the interruption. That's where control transfers. Not to motivation. Not to force. But to continuity itself. Your body begins to expect continuation the same way it used to expect delay. The pattern flips. Instead of preparing to stop, it prepares to keep going. And because of that, the interruptions lose their timing. They arrive too late. The movement is already in place. This is how small actions extend their influence. They don't just start the sequence. They protect it. By removing hesitation at the beginning, and reducing interruption in the middle, they stabilize the entire chain. So nothing collapses halfway anymore. And once the chain holds from start to continuation, the need for large effort disappears as a requirement. It becomes optional. something that can appear on top of a stable base, instead of replacing it. The action continues. And for the first time, it doesn't feel like something you are trying to maintain. It feels like something that maintains itself. The pattern doesn't disappear. It gets replaced. You sit down again, same position, same environment. The old delay tries to appear, but it no longer fits. Your hands don't wait for confirmation. They move as soon as they touch the surface. The action begins before anything can interrupt it. There is no pause to observe. Your shoulders settle forward immediately. Your breath aligns with movement instead of holding it back. The first step connects to the next without hesitation, and the next follows without needing to be decided. The sequence holds. What used to feel like control, waiting, adjusting, preparing, now feels unnecessary. It has no function here. The movement doesn't improve from delay. It only weakens when delay is present. So the body stops allowing it. You don't remove the hesitation by force. You replace it with speed of initiation. Not speed in intensity, but speed in beginning. The action starts before the pattern can form. That becomes the rule. No gap. The moment your hand reaches the task, it moves. No internal check. No silent approval. No alignment process. The start happens on contact. And because it happens every time, the body begins to expect it. The expectation changes everything. Where there used to be a pause, there is now immediate motion. Where there used to be evaluation, there is now continuation. The system doesn't ask if the action is worth doing. It executes because that's what happens when the moment arrives. Nothing else is considered. Your fingers tighten into the work without delay. Your posture doesn't collapse backward. It holds forward as the default. The sequence runs without interruption, not because you are forcing it, but because there is no alternative pattern left to follow. That's where stability forms. It's not built on effort. It's built on removal. The removal of hesitation. The removal of negotiation. The removal of any space where the action can be questioned. And once that space is gone, the action becomes automatic. Not perfect. Not intense. But consistent. You no longer rely on larger effort to prove anything. The need for that fades because the base is already stable. Small actions carry everything forward, and they do it without resistance. They don't wait. They don't check. They don't ask. They begin. And because they begin every time, the chain no longer breaks. The pattern that once controlled the start has no place to return. There is no opening for it. No delay for it to attach to. Only movement. This is where discipline stops feeling like something you are trying to build. It becomes something that runs without interruption. Something that happens the moment the condition appears. The task is in front of you. Your hand moves. That is the entire decision. The action no longer waits for permission. It doesn't check if it's worth doing. It doesn't measure itself against some larger standard. The moment appears, and the movement follows. No delay. No internal approval. No adjustment before beginning. That gap is gone. What used to control everything, the pause, the hesitation, the silent negotiation, has no position left. It cannot form if there is no time for it. And there is no time when the body moves immediately. This is where the shift locks in. Not because the effort becomes stronger, but because the start becomes automatic. The smallest action no longer feels optional. It happens the same way every time. Direct. Immediate. Without discussion. And because it happens every time, it builds. The chain holds without needing to be reinforced by intensity. There is no need to prove anything through larger effort. The base is already stable. Movement leads to movement, without interruption. That stability replaces everything else. You no longer rely on bursts of effort to compensate for inconsistency. You no longer wait for the right condition to begin. The condition is simple, the moment exists, so the action starts. Nothing else is required. The body follows this without resistance because it has been repeated enough times. Not as a decision, but as a pattern. And once it becomes a pattern, it doesn't need to be maintained. It runs. That is where discipline holds. Not in how hard you push, but in how quickly you begin. Not in how much you do, but in how consistently you remove the gap before doing it. The hesitation is no longer something to fight. It is something that has no place to exist. And when that space is gone, the action becomes what you do, every time, without exception. This is no longer a choice. It is the behavior that remains.